Hi everyone, it's Monica, and welcome back to Tailor-Made Cards for You. Well, today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not going to actually put a card together, but I wanted to share with you my process for putting together one of the new die sets that just came out. Now this, of course, is Jolly St. Nick, and it's one of the new Colorize dies that Tim Holtz just recently came out with. Now, when you look at the completed die image, it's really cute. It has lots of layers, but what you don't see is the process for putting it together to get it to be this cute. And I wanted to go ahead and walk through this with you and show you some of my tips and tricks that I learned along the way, because had I known this going into it, I probably would have had less frustration along the way. Now, before you get started, there are a few tools that I'm going to recommend. Now, you're going to want to have a nice pick, because there's a lot of little pieces that you're going to want to pick out and not lose when you're die cutting your images. You also want to have some tweezers, because again, you're working with some small images. And then there's a couple of ways you can go for your adhesive. I went the glue adhesive way, so I had a really fine tip glue pen, and then I had a really fine tip glue bottle. And then I also had a tool that picked up some of my small images. Now, I know some of the other videos that are out there, they recommend doing the die cuts on double-sided adhesive, which is probably fine as well, but when you're working with such small images, sometimes it's hard to get the backing off. Now, one of the things that was great about this new die set, and I have to compliment Sizzix and Tim Holtz in the foresight of this, is when you die cut the main image. So for instance, this piece that I'm showing you here, it will actually emboss the parts where you're going to layer. So when you're working with your main image and you're looking to add your layers, you're going to be able to see where your pieces go. And then you also see on the back where it gives you your colors. So again, if you want to do different shades of red, you have red 1, red 2, and red 3, and it will help you keep the pieces together for the different layers. So the biggest tip that I can give you when you're going into this project and putting the Santa together is you want to be organized. You want to have your tools all laid out. You want to have your colors picked out ahead of time. And then when you actually run your die pieces through your Big Shot or your Vagabond or whatever die cutting machine that you're going to use, you want to keep your pieces separated and your similar colors together. So for instance, when you have red 1, if you're using different shades of red, you want to cut your die for red 1 and then keep that group together. And then when you go to die cut your red 2, if you're using different shades, again, keep those together. And I would recommend, even if you are using the same colors, so for instance, on this particular Santa, I used the same color for the suit, and then I had my sander to distress the edges a little bit. I still found that you want to keep the die pieces separated, because when you go to put your Santa together, if you have them all together, the pieces are so small, you're going to get confused as to what is what. So after I chose my colors and I have all my pieces separated, you can see that some of these pieces are really small. You're ready to get started. So here's an example of one of these pieces. And again, when you're doing your die cutting, make sure that your die cut panel, the bottom part, is clean, because some of these pieces that you'll have left over when you cut your die, you might think are trash when they really aren't. You're going to need them. So just be really careful. I know when I was doing my die cutting, I would die cut and then I would take my whole bottom panel over to my desk, and then I would make sure I had all my pieces based on the die that I was cutting. Now, my process that I'm going to share with you is my process, and it's just what I found to be the easiest. It's not necessarily the right or the wrong way, but it's what I found to be the easiest. And the way that I started is I started with the belt, because that's the middle part, and that's what's going to put together the bottom part of your Santa, which are the pants, and then the top part, which is kind of your face. So with your belt, you're going to have your black pieces, and then you're going to have one gray piece, which is going to be kind of the highlight of the belt. Now, ordinarily, when I am doing card demonstrations or any type of demonstration on YouTube, I don't really focus on the adhesive, because a lot of different adhesives work great. But I will say for this Santa, I highly recommend that you get a smooth precision glue pen. And this is a glue pen that has a really fine tip, enabling you to add small parts of glue onto these small images. And you're going to see me use this glue pen throughout the video, and it's from Nuvo. And I highly recommend you have a precision glue pen when working with this die set. Now, I know that, like I said earlier in the video, some people have recommended die cutting these pieces onto double-sided adhesive, which is fine as well. But I found with glue, you have some movement, and I really thought that that was essential when I was putting together my Santa, because when you're lining up your pieces, you may not get it lined up exactly right the first time, and if you're using double-sided adhesive, it may not be forgiving. But when you're using a wet glue, it is somewhat forgiving, and you can move around your piece that you're working with. Now, the other glue adhesive that I used and I thought worked really well was, again, from Nuvo, and it's the Deluxe Adhesive, which is a clear drying craft glue. And I use this for bigger pieces because, again, I just use the precision pen for some of those really skinny, thin pieces. And then I used my other glue for some of the bigger pieces. And when you're adding your layers, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to see some indentation, some embossing, if you will, on some of the main pieces. So on this belt, you had your long piece, and then you had a smaller black piece, and you can actually see the indentation on the larger black belt portion to show you exactly how to line up your layers. And that was ingenious. I think that is just critical to be able to get these lined up exactly how you want them. And you may not be able to see it in the video, but when you actually go to die cut your images, you're going to see what I'm talking about. So after you get your belt put together, you're going to have a couple more small black pieces, and these are the boots. So you want to make sure that you put those boots aside, and the craft mat that I'm working on has your black portion on the left and then the white portion on the right. And what I ended up doing is, to keep my pieces together, I just put those black little boots right on the white piece, and I kept them together because when I go to put the body together, I'm going to put those on first. And that's kind of how I approached it. I tried to work through the die plates, so that way I knew that I used all the pieces that I needed to use. All right, so you can kind of see the indentions on this red piece here. And as you can see, there's a lot of indentions, so there's going to be several layers on this piece. And with the belt piece complete, I went ahead and added the adhesive to the belt, and I'm going to stick him right on the red suit here. Now, one thing that I want to recommend also when you're going along, there's a couple of types of paper that you can use, right? You can use just regular plain paper, or you can also use distress paper. And when I say distress paper, this is the paper that when you take a sander to it, it kind of distresses it. And this is from Ranger, and that's what this maroon paper is. And I ended up sanding it along the way, but what I would recommend is, if you have any of that paper that you're going to sand and distress, do that before you actually start gluing the pieces. And then also with the white pieces, if you decide not to go different shades of white, if you're going to do any distressing, the color that I would probably recommend is the Vintage Photo Distress Ink or Distress Oxide. You don't want it to be too dark, so maybe mute it a little bit. And then once you add your ink, just keep using the same pad because you don't need it to be really dark. But I would go ahead and add my distress ink to my white pieces before I actually started gluing it down. And what you're going to find, this is going to work because when you start working with some of these smaller pieces, you're going to get glue on your fingers, and you want to make sure that you don't smear that ink. Also, I would recommend that you have some sort of wet wipe or wet rag kind of sitting next to you, because again, you're going to be getting glue on your fingers, and when you're working with those white pieces, you don't want that glue to kind of stain your white pieces, so you may want to have just a wet rag to dry off and clean off your fingertips. Okay, so for the bottom portion of the Santa, I've now got the belt attached, and I also got the little boots attached. And now I'm going to go ahead and start working with the layers. And the way that I approach the layers is I just took one die plate at a time, and I tried to add as many pieces as I could from that die plate. I didn't jump around too much. So for instance, if I had one piece that had, you know, a couple of layers, I didn't necessarily layer all those up. I worked by die plate. So anything that I could add based on the die plate that I was working with at that moment, I would add it. And the reason I approached it that way is because, again, you have a lot of pieces. So the faster you can get through the pieces on one particular die plate, the better off you are in probably not losing it or having a hard time figuring it out where it goes. Now, the Santa that I'm working on right now is actually the third Santa that I've put together. The first two Santas, I didn't use any different types of paper. I used all the same reds and all the same whites, and then I just sanded and I highlighted. But on this third Santa that we're putting together right now, for the white portion, I did use that kind of violet color that you see on the top part of my screen, just because I wanted to see what the contrast looked like. Now, another idea, of course, if you don't want to use different color of cardstock, you could easily get out some of your inks and highlight and color up some of your paper using your inks. So for instance, on your whites, you could easily take some of your one of your layers and maybe use antique linen. And what I would say is, if you are going to use ink for your different layers, is ink up your cardstock first, let it dry completely, and then cut out your pieces. If you try to ink up some of those smaller pieces after they're cut, you might end up tearing them or bending them, which would not be good at all. So just ink up your paper before you actually get going, and then cut it out. Now, as I start to work through my layers, you're going to see why I think it's really important to have some sort of a tool that has a pick on it. I almost felt like when I was putting the Santa together that I was in surgery, and I should have had an assistant, and I should have said scalpel, and then they would have handed me my tool, because on a couple of the pieces I was actually using my tweezer and my little pointer stick to kind of maneuver some of my pieces, because these pieces are small, and then once you get glue on them, it's a whole new story. So having those tweezers and then having a really pointy pick to help maneuver these pieces to exactly where they need to go, I found was critical. Now, I know when you're watching this video, some of you might be really intimidated by this die set. But what I would say is, again, organization is key. Have everything cut out, have everything kind of put in its own spot. So when you do go to put these pieces together, you're not trying to figure out what piece goes where. You might still have that a little bit, but by having the pieces separated, at least you have an idea of what your layers are. Now, as I continue on with the layering, you're going to notice that the reason that I actually recommended using the glue is once I get my piece onto the first layer, sometimes I move it around, and that's because these pieces are notched perfectly to fit exactly where they need to fit. So for instance, that white piece that I just added on the top portion, it has a little notch that will butt up exactly to the belt. And when I first put it on, I didn't have it exactly in that notch, but by having the glue on the back side, I was able to just kind of slide it right into where it needed to be. And then I added my distress ink, which again, I recommend distressing your white pieces before you actually start gluing them down. But I distressed it along the way. But that's kind of a lesson learned, that you're going to want to add your distress ink or any of your highlights before you actually start gluing your pieces down. And then clean your fingertips, because what I found is as I added my ink and then I added my glue, I had some of that brown ink on my fingers, and that kind of transferred onto some of my white cardstock. And you want to try to avoid that if at all possible. Okay, so when I started to put the white layers on the Santa, and these are the cuffs at the bottom of the boot, and then you have a cuff on his sleeve, and then you also have some white over on the left side of the belt. These pieces, when you're working with, they're pretty obvious, so they're not real difficult to point out, and I didn't have any problem determining what piece went where. So the bottom portion of the Santa was not real difficult. Now when you get to the face, that's when it's going to become a little bit more difficult, because some of these pieces are really small and you may have a hard time figuring it out. So what I would say is, when you go to approach the face, start with the bigger pieces first, because obviously those are going to be the ones that will be your bottom layers, and then work up. So when you're trying to figure out where to start on the face, your first inclination might be to put his actual face together, but just kind of take the biggest layers first and then work up. When you're working with some of these smaller pieces, it's a lot easier to add the smaller pieces to bigger pieces that you've already put together, rather than trying to add layers on small pieces. So when I get to the eyes, I'll kind of explain a little bit more what I'm talking about. But try to create big pieces to work with, rather than trying to glue a small piece on something that's just a little bit bigger than that small piece. Okay, so after I got that last white piece glued down, then the bottom portion pretty much was complete. Now, one thing I found that was interesting is when you're actually looking at the Santa on the die set, you don't realize that it's three pieces. You have the bottom part, which is the suit, and then you have the face portion, I'll say, which is your beard and the face, and then you have the hat. And these are actually separate. So when you're actually working with your Santa, if you're going to glue it down on some background or some cardstock, it's really not a big deal, right? Because you're just going to go ahead and layer them and the pieces slot together perfectly. But if you're trying to create an individual Santa and you're not quite sure what you're going to do with the Santas, so say you're just sitting down and you're just putting several of these Santas together, then you don't want to end up with three pieces. You want your Santa kind of to work together. So I'm going to show you how I approach this. There may be a better way out there. There's not a lot of videos yet on these new Colorize dies, but I'll show you how I approach this as well. And it seemed to work fine. But I wanted to have individual Santas because, again, I'm going to create several of these Santas, and then I'm just going to kind of put them aside. And then as I start to create my projects, I'll have them already made. Because let's face it, these Santas do take a little bit of time. And once you have your process down, if you can create like 3 or 4 of them in one sitting, it's probably going to be a lot easier than trying to create them as you do your project. Okay, so I just added the first layer on the face, and it's that purple color that you're looking at right now, and that was the biggest piece. And then from there I just started adding my notches. So the piece that I'm working on right now has that little curl on the left hand side, and I found the paste that kind of notches perfectly into that. And like I said, as you're going along, as you get through some of these pieces, they're really going to stand out what pieces go where. So just work from the biggest ones to the smallest ones is what I can say. And as you go along, you're going to find that you're going to be able to identify easily where your pieces go. And take advantage of the pieces that are really obvious in shape. Like, for instance, on the piece that I'm going to work on right now, you have a real distinct cheekbone. And the piece that I'm working on, you can see where that cheekbone matches up. And it makes it really easy to layer it. So when you're looking at your pieces, figure out exactly where your notches are and what lines up. And you'll be able to make sure that you have a nice layered face. Now that purple color was my second layer, so I tried to work through some of that layer just to make sure I had all of my secondary layer adhered where it needed to go. So I went ahead and I just started figuring out where those purple pieces went, and then I started putting those together. Part of it was the hat. It had a couple different shades where the white portion of the Santa hat goes, so I went ahead and I determined exactly where that needed to go, and then I glued it to the top. And the piece that I just glued down, this is going to actually attach to the very top, but when you go to add that red part, that's the part that kind of is free floating, and I had to go ahead and maneuver it just a little bit to make sure that my Santa was one piece. Okay, so once I figured out exactly how I was going to approach that, then I went ahead and I started working on the face. this is what really makes your Santa come to life, when you actually get the face down and you add the eyes, because this is what really animates him. But the face has some of the smallest pieces that you're going to be working with, so just keep that in mind. Your eyes are really small, and then to top it off, you have little black pieces where the pupils are that are even smaller. So this is where I almost felt like I was in surgery, because I was using two tools at the same time, trying to get my eyes lined up and the eyebrows lined up. The pieces were sticking to my finger. It was quite humorous. But what was nice about the face is the face also has those indentions, so you can see exactly where the eyes need to go, and it kind of guides you along. So what I would say to that is just take your time, get your tools. A couple times I had to pull out my tweezers and use the pick at the same time, because the pieces were sticking to my fingers. So if you find that you have too much of that glue adhesive on your fingertips, then you can easily use your wet wipe that you've have ready sitting on the sidelines to kind of clean off your fingertips, so that way you don't have your pieces moving all over the place. And then when you get some of these smaller pieces actually adhered where they need to go, let them dry, because a couple times I found when I went to add another piece, the eyes, for instance, weren't completely dried, and I ended up moving it. So when you get these smaller pieces adhered exactly where you want them to go, just give it a minute and let them dry, or maybe move on to a different part of the face, or a highlight, so that way you're not manipulating some of the pieces that you may have just laid down. Now when you're approaching the pink cheeks, you're going to want to lay down the two pink cheeks first, and then the mustache. So don't do the nose, because the nose actually goes on top of the mustache. So get your two pinks adhered, and then the cheeks actually have some brown tones. You can do that before or after. I found it really didn't make a difference. But the nose you want to do after you actually put down the mustache. And then once you have that mustache adhered, you're going to find that it created the perfect little slot for the tan-toned tongue, and then the pink highlight. Now the three highlights, the two on the cheeks and then the one on the nose, those are the pieces that I actually didn't realize were part of the Santa face when I created the very first Santa. So these are probably the smallest pieces that you're going to be working with. So when you're doing your neutral color or your tan for the face, just make sure that you have three little highlights, and those are the pieces that are going to go on the two cheeks and the nose. And you wouldn't think that three little pieces would be so important, but when you actually get them on the cheeks and then on the nose, they really help to highlight the face. Now another piece that is really easy to overlook is the hand, which is a really small piece as well. And I would have thought that would have been a neutral color, but I found when I was working with the die pieces, it actually is part of the goldenrod color. And this is the die that had the belt buckle. So you're going to have a really small piece that is going to work for the hand. So you're going to want to go ahead and add that goldenrod for the hand. And then while you're at it, you can go ahead and also add the glasses. And the middle part of the glasses fit perfectly over the nose. So use that as your guide, and then just kind of adjust the glasses. What I found is your glasses are going to go a little bit below those beige highlights that you just added. So when you're using your pick, just try to maneuver the glasses so they're just below those tan highlights. Okay, so now that we have the face added, you can see that the Santa is really starting to come to life. And it is such a difference when you add the eyes and the little rosy cheeks. Now, all you have to do is just complete the hat portion, and then add the eyebrows, and you're almost there. So just go ahead and work with the remaining white pieces to add your hat layering. And then you're going to have another red piece that kind of has a curve going up, and you're going to add the little pom-pom as well. Now on the pom-pom you have a couple of small pieces, so don't lose those. You're going to have a small dot, and then you're going to have a piece that kind of looks like an eyebrow, I guess, but it's a really thin one. But you'll be able to see the indentation on the white pom-pom. So just be aware of that you do have a couple more small pieces. And then you're going to take that white pom-pom and glue it to the red portion of your hat. And what I would recommend is get the layering of your hat completed first. You can see that white part where my left hand is. You want to get that white piece on because the eyebrow actually does layer over that just a bit. So you want to have that layering down. Now, one thing that I found after the fact is there actually are a couple of layers of the eyebrows. In my example here, you would have had 2 purple pieces, which were the bottom layer against your eyebrows. But I didn't use those. I just thought it looked a little bit bulky. Maybe on my 4th Santa that I create, I'll actually add the 2 layers of eyebrows. But I didn't do it on this particular one. Believe it or not, even with this being my 3rd Santa, I did learn a few things. Again, I learned about those eyebrows that had a couple of layers, and then there were a couple of pieces on the actual suit that I didn't add on the 1st Santa because they were so small I didn't even know they were pieces. But I'll point those out to you towards the end of the video in just a minute here. All right, now I know this is a long video, but we're on the home stretch, so stick with me here. So with the top portion of the face pretty much complete, I wanted to go ahead and make my Santa into one. And this is where if you're layering it onto some cardstock, you wouldn't have a problem because you would just glue down the pieces and they would notch together. But I wanted to create one Santa. So you're going to want to go ahead and just get that middle portion that goes behind the belt. That's kind of what I worked with. So I glued that down, and then I just kind of maneuvered the piece over the white beard. And I added just enough glue to hold it because you're going to see in a minute here, I'm going to flip the Santa over and I'm going to add some washi tape. Yes, you know, I love my washi tape. And this is just another way that you can use it. But I'm going to go ahead and add the washi tape to the back, and that's going to help hold my Santa together. And then at that point, I pretty much have one piece. All I need to do is worry about the hat. And I'm going to show you here exactly what I did. So I went ahead and I added the pom-pom like I talked about a minute ago. And you have a real small piece that is holding that pom-pom on, so just give that a minute to dry. And then when you have that completely dry, you're just going to go ahead and take that red piece and butt it up against that white piece to be able to have your hat exactly attached to the top and not have it as a loose layer. And then once I added the hat, that pretty much was it. Now, I wanted to point out a couple of pieces that I missed on my first 2 Santas, and I'm going to show you that here side by side. So the first Santa that I created is on the left, and the Santa that we just created is on the right. Now, the 2 pieces that I actually missed where there's a small piece that goes right under the armpit for your Santa, and that's going to kind of help highlight your arm. So you're going to want to make sure that you get that piece, and that's going to be on your 3rd layer, I want to say. And then the other piece that I missed was the part that actually is right between his legs. And it's kind of a V, or I should say maybe a Y. But again, this is the 3rd layer. So when you're looking at your dies, it's going to be red 3 where you're going to see these pieces. And these are highlights as well. So just keep that in mind, that you are going to have on that 3rd layer some really small pieces, and then that helps to highlight under the arm and then where the legs are. So for those of you that stuck it out, I hope that this video was helpful for you. And if you do decide to get this cute little Santa die, that the video will help you approach putting it together. It could be a little bit intimidating when you first start, but use some of these tips that I recommended, and hopefully you can get through it and be happy at the end with your little Santa. So I'll leave a list of all the products that I used to put the Santa together, along with links to the stores. And if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. Feel free to share the video if you'd like, and leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought of the tutorial. All right, everybody, thanks so much for stopping by, and we'll see you again next time.